It was 3 hours before dawn in the high valley of Granite Basin, and the thermometer nailed to the porch of the largest house in the territory had stopped registering temperature. The mercury had simply retreated into the bulb, effectively surrendering to a freeze that cracked pine branches like dry gunfire. Inside that large house, despite a stone fireplace big enough to roast a steer, the water in the wash basin had frozen solid. This was the reality of the winter of 1888, a season that didn't just chill the bone, it hunted you. The town's wealthiest cattleman, Marcus Thorne, was currently awake, wrapped in 3 buffalo robes, feeding oak logs into a roaring hearth that seemed to eat fuel without giving back any heat. The heat went up, the cold stayed down. It was simple physics, and it was killing them. Across the valley, a mile away on a scrubby patch of land that nobody else wanted, there was no smoke rising from Arthur Penhaligon's cabin. To the casual observer, and there were many, given how much the town enjoyed mocking the young homesteader, the lack of smoke meant one of 2 things. Either Arthur had run out of wood, or he was already dead. In a winter this aggressive, silence was usually a funeral announcement. Thorne stood at his frosted window, watching that distant, dark roofline through a brass telescope, shaking his head with a grim sort of satisfaction. He had warned Sarah. He had told her that marrying a man who prioritized books over common sense was a death sentence. But inside that small, unassuming cabin, the situation was confusingly different. There was no roar of a fire. There was no pile of buffalo robes. In fact, Arthur was sleeping under a single wool blanket, and he was sweating. The air in the room was heavy, still, and undeniably thick with warmth. He rolled over, kicking the blanket off his legs, and glanced at the crude alcohol thermometer sitting on the strange, hulking mass of clay and stone that dominated the center of the room. It read 72 degrees. Outside, the world was 50 below zero. The difference was impossible by any standard known to the territory. It was a statistical anomaly that would eventually rewrite the architectural history of the region, but right now it was just a secret shared between a sleeping man and a pile of mud. The town thought he was freezing to death, unaware that he had effectively turned his entire floor into a battery. The mockery hadn't started that night. It had begun 6 months earlier, under the blistering sun of July, when the stakes were theoretical and the sweat was real. The territory operated on a very specific set of rules. You built a box, you cut a hole in the roof, and you built a vertical shaft of stone to suck smoke out. If you were rich, the fireplace was big. If you were poor, it was small. But the design never changed. It was tradition, and in the West, tradition was treated with more reverence than scripture. Arthur, a man who had spent more time fixing mill gears than riding horses, looked at the traditional fireplace and saw a pump. It was a machine designed to pump warm air out of a house and replace it with cold air from the cracks in the walls. "You're trying to heat the sky, Marcus," Arthur had said one afternoon outside the general store, pointing to the massive chimney on Thorne's new mansion. "That draw is so strong it's going to pull the heat right off your skin." Thorne had laughed, a deep, resonant sound that drew a crowd. "Heat rises, boy. That's God's law. You build a big fire, you get a big heat. Don't complicate simple things." Sarah was there that day, standing by her father's wagon, clutching her bonnet against the wind. She looked at Arthur with eyes that held a terrifying mixture of hope and doubt. She was the one who had to live in the house Arthur was building. Her father had made it clear, if the cabin wasn't fit for a woman of her constitution by first snow, the engagement was off. The town saw a debate about masonry. Arthur saw a fight for his future. The urgency of the build was driven by 2 things, the fading light of autumn and the specific fragility of Sarah's health. She wasn't weak, but a bout of lung fever 2 winters ago had left her susceptible to the damp cold that permeated standard cabins. Her father, a stoic wagon-wright named Miller, wasn't a cruel man, just a practical one. "I like you, Arthur. Miller had said, leaning against the rough-hewn frame of the cabin in late August. "But love don't keep a body warm when the wind is howling out of the north. You get this place sealed and hot, or she stays with us. I won't bury my daughter because you wanted to experiment." Arthur felt the weight of that promise every time he lifted a shovel. He wasn't building a home. He was building a life support system. He had spent his evenings reading tattered engineering manuals sent from the East, specifically focusing on the dynamics of kilns and industrial furnaces. The principle he settled on was radical for a residential cabin. He wasn't going to let the heat escape. He was going to trap it, torture it, and force it to surrender every calorie of energy before it was allowed to leave the building. This meant rejecting the vertical fireplace entirely. The constraints were brutal. He had no money for cast iron stoves and no team of horses to haul massive granite slabs. He had the clay soil beneath his boots, the river rocks from the creek bed, and a pile of straw. He had to build with mass, not money. While other men were stacking logs for walls, Arthur was digging a trench through the center of his cabin floor. It looked like a grave. That was the first rumor that started spreading through town, that the pressure had cracked him and he was digging a root cellar in the middle of his living room, or worse, a crypt. "It's about dwell time," Arthur muttered to himself, his hands caked in gray mud as he mixed the cob, a slurry of clay, sand, and straw. He needed the fire to burn sideways. If the flame went up, it moved too fast. If he forced it sideways through a heavily insulated tunnel, he could raise the temperature of the burn to a point where the wood gas itself ignited. No smoke, no waste. But to do that, he had to bury the firebox inside a thermal battery. He began constructing a massive serpentine bench of stone and mud that wound its way through the main room. It was ugly. It looked like a giant earthen snake had died and fossilized in his parlor. Neighbors would ride by, slowing their horses, to gawk at the open door where Arthur was wrestling with hundreds of pounds of wet earth. "Hey, Artie," one of Thorne's ranch hands yelled out one afternoon. "You building a house or a brick oven? You planning to bake yourself?" They laughed, the sound carrying easily in the thin mountain air. Arthur didn't look up. He was busy calculating the cross-sectional area of the riser. If the ratio was off by even an inch, the smoke would back up into the room and choke them. If it was too wide, the draft would stall. He was walking a razor's edge of physics, and he was doing it with mud. The construction phase was a lesson in physical misery. Mixing cob required stomping the wet clay and straw with bare feet to get the consistency right, turning the mixture until it was a homogeneous, sticky putty. Arthur's legs were stained permanently gray, his skin cracked and bleeding from the abrasive sand. He worked by lantern light long after the sun went down, terrified that the clay wouldn't dry before the first hard freeze. Wet cob and freezing temperatures would expand and crumble, destroying the entire system. He was racing the weather, and the weather was winning. He built the burn tunnel first, lining it with the most heat-resistant stones he could find in the creek, cemented with a precise mixture of clay and ash. Then came the riser, a vertical chimney inside the mass that would create the engine of the draft. But instead of venting this riser out the roof, he capped it, forcing the hot gas to hit the top, mushroom over, and be dragged down the sides by the cooling draft. It was counterintuitive. Hot air wants to go up. He was forcing it down. This struggle created turbulence, and turbulence meant heat transfer. Then came the strangest part. The exhaust flue ran horizontally along the floor, encased in 2 tons of stone and mud that formed a wide, low bench. The idea was that by the time the exhaust gas actually reached the final chimney to leave the house, it would be cool. He wanted the smoke to leave the house at little more than room temperature. If the smoke was hot, he argued, he was throwing away fuel. "Waste is a sin," he told Sarah one afternoon when she brought him a basket of biscuits. She was looking at the monstrous clay structure that took up a third of the floor space. It wasn't the cozy hearth she had dreamed of. It was a hulking, gray industrial fixture. "Arthur," she said softly, touching the rough surface of the drying mud. "It's very big." "It has to be," he explained, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a battery. We charge it with fire for 2 hours, and it holds the heat for 24. You won't have to wake up in the night to add logs. You can sit on this bench and feel the warmth against your back all day." Sarah tried to smile, but her eyes darted to the window. "Marcus says it won't draw. He says smoke will fill the room and we'll suffocate in our sleep. He told Father that it's irresponsible." "Marcus burns a tree a week to keep one room warm," Arthur snapped, the exhaustion fraying his temper. "Trust me, Sarah, please. The math works." "I trust you," she whispered, though her hand trembled slightly. "But Father is coming to inspect it in November. If it's cold, Arthur, if it's cold, he won't let me stay." The social friction in Granite Basin wasn't just about gossip. It was about survival hierarchies. Men like Marcus Thorne held power because they controlled resources, cattle, land, and the timber rights in the upper wooded slopes. A man who needed 10 cords of wood to survive the winter was a man who had to buy timber or pay for grazing rights to harvest it. The economy of the town was built on the inefficiency of the traditional fireplace. You worked hard to cut wood to stay warm so you could work hard the next day. Arthur's project was an unintended insult to this system. As the structure dried and the final layer of smooth plaster was applied, the town's ridicule sharpened into hostility. At the saloon, the betting pool wasn't about whether the cabin would work. It was about when Arthur would come begging for help. They called the structure the sarcophagus because of its resemblance to a stone tomb. "It ain't natural," Miller said to a group of men by the blacksmith's forge. Sarah's father was looking for a reason to be proud of his future son-in-law, but the peer pressure was immense. "A fire needs to breathe. You box it in like that, you're creating a bomb. I'm half a mind to forbid the marriage just on account of his sanity." "He's broke, that's the thing," Thorne added, leaning back on a barrel, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "He can't afford a proper mason, so he's playing with mud pies. It's sad, really. Sarah deserves a man who can provide a hearth, not a hole in the ground." Arthur heard the whispers. He saw the looks when he walked into town to buy flour. He stopped trying to explain the thermodynamics of the system. He realized that you cannot use logic to dismantle a tradition that people use to define their own toughness. They took pride in the fact that their houses were cold, that they had to break ice in the morning. It was proof of their resilience. Arthur didn't want to be resilient. He wanted to be comfortable. The final test came in late October. The clay was dry. The first true cold front was rolling down from the peaks, turning the sky a bruised purple. Arthur invited Miller to the cabin for the firing. It wasn't a party. It was a trial. Miller arrived alone, looking grim, wearing his heavy coat as if he expected to never take it off. "Let's see it then," Miller grunted, standing in the cold, unheated room. The thermal mass was stone cold to the touch. The air inside was barely warmer than the air outside. Arthur knelt by the small, strange opening at the base of the riser. He didn't have a giant log. He had a handful of twigs and some split pine scraps, an embarrassing amount of fuel by local standards. "This is it?" Miller asked, skepticism dripping from his voice. "You plan to heat this barn with kindling?" "Watch," Arthur said. He struck a match. The confrontation that followed the lighting of the fire was quiet, confusing, and deeply unsettling for Miller. When Arthur lit the kindling, the fire didn't billow out into the room. It was sucked instantly, violently, sideways into the tunnel with a sound that resembled a distant jet engine, a low, rhythmic roar. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The draw was ferocious. "What is that noise?" Miller asked, taking a step back. "It sounds like a forge." "That's the sound of efficiency," Arthur said, feeding a few more sticks into the maw. It's burning the smoke." For the first hour, nothing happened. The room remained cold. The massive battery of stone and mud was absorbing every ounce of energy the fire produced. Miller paced the floor, checking his pocket watch. "I've been here 60 minutes, Arthur. I can still see my breath. Thorne's house would be toasty by now." "Thorne's house is heating the air," Arthur said calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I'm heating the stone. Give it time." "I don't have time," Miller snapped, "and neither does Sarah. If this is your grand plan to wait 3 hours for a spark of warmth." But then the shift happened. It didn't come as a blast of hot air. It radiated. The bench, which ran along the entire north wall, began to emit a gentle, pervasive heat. It was the feeling of standing next to a sun-baked rock in the evening, but it was coming from inside the house. Miller stopped pacing. He took off his gloves. He walked over to the bench and placed his hand on the plaster. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but deeply, solidly warm. "The exhaust," Arthur said, pointing to the pipe leaving the wall. "Touch the pipe outside." Miller frowned but opened the door. He walked to the chimney pipe sticking out of the wall. He tentatively tapped it with a bare finger. He didn't recoil. He grabbed it. It was lukewarm. He looked up at the clear sky, then back at the roaring sound coming from the intake inside. "Where's the heat going?" Miller asked, genuinely baffled. "The fire is roaring, but the smoke is cold." "It's in the bench," Arthur said, standing in the doorway, "and it will stay there for the next 20 hours. The real challenge, however, wasn't convincing Miller. It was the public wager that happened 3 days later. Emboldened by the success of the test, Arthur made a mistake. He went to the saloon to celebrate with a single beer, and he ran into Marcus Thorne. "Hear you didn't freeze," Thorne sneered, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Miller says you built a magic bench." "I built a heater that works," Arthur replied, setting his glass down. "I use 1/10 the wood you do, Marcus, and I don't have to wear a coat to breakfast." The room went quiet. "You didn't challenge a man's woodpile in Granite Basin." "Is that a fact?" Thorne stood up, towering over the younger man. "Tell you what, Mudman, the big freeze is coming next week. The almanac says we'll hit 60 below. Why don't we put a wager on it? I'll come to your little hut with a thermometer. If your mud pie can hold 50 degrees without you feeding it every 10 minutes, I'll pay for your wedding. But if it drops, you admit that you're risking Sarah's life, and you tear that monstrosity down." Arthur looked at the men surrounding him. He saw the doubt, the amusement. He thought of the thermal mass, the way the heat soaked into the core of the house. "Not 50 degrees, Arthur said, his voice steady. 70, and I won't feed the fire after midnight." The saloon erupted in laughter. 70 degrees without a fire running? It was physically impossible. Thorne grinned, sensing an easy victory. 70 degrees. Done. Prepare to tear down your house, boy. The blizzard arrived not as a storm, but as a suffocating blanket of white violence that erased the horizon within 20 minutes of the sun dipping below the peaks. This was the wolf winter the elders had whispered about, a pressure system so dense and cold it felt malicious. In town, the mood shifted from mockery to frantic preparation. The wager between Arthur and Thorne was the talk of the saloon, but as the wind speed increased, stripping shingles off the church roof, the betting stopped. Survival took precedence. Men were busy boarding up windows and dragging livestock into kitchens, desperate to preserve body heat. The temperature dropped past 0, then 10 below, then 20. By the time darkness fully settled, the air was cold enough to freeze the moisture in a man's nose instantly. At Arthur's cabin, the preparation looked entirely different, and this difference was the core of the controversy. While Thorne was having his ranch hands haul 3 cords of seasoned oak onto his veranda, a massive pile of potential energy, Arthur was inside with a small hand scale, weighing a basket of pine scraps. He wasn't panic stacking, he was measuring. He had exactly 30 pounds of wood. To the average homesteader, 30 pounds of wood in a blizzard was a suicide note. It was barely enough to keep a pot of coffee warm for an hour on an open hearth. But Arthur wasn't feeding a hearth. He was charging a battery. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in a shawl, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. She had defied her father's request to stay in town, choosing to weather the storm here. It was a romantic gesture, but as the wind began to scream against the north wall, the reality of her choice settled in. "The walls are cold, Arthur," she said, her voice tight. "I can feel the draft coming through the door frame." "That's just the infiltration," Arthur muttered, checking the seal on the firebox door. "The mass hasn't woken up yet. We have to drive it hard for 2 hours. Once the core hits 600 degrees, the reaction changes." He looked at her, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to calculate away. "Put your hand on the bench. Tell me what you feel." She reached out and touched the plastered mud surface. It was stone cold. "Trust the lag time," he said, more to himself than to her. "The heat is traveling through 6 inches of dense cob. It takes time." He struck the match. The system roared to life, that same unsettling jet engine sound that Miller had hated. But this time, the sound was the only thing standing between them and the killing freeze outside. The physics of the burn were counterintuitive to anyone raised on the romance of an open fire. In a standard fireplace, you see the flames, you feel the radiant heat on your face, but you also feel the cold draft hitting your back as the fire sucks air from the room to feed itself. It's a net loss equation disguised as comfort. Arthur's system was sealed. The air intake was calibrated. When the fire caught the split pine, it didn't lazily drift upward. It was dragged horizontally into the insulated burn tunnel where the temperatures spiked rapidly. Inside that hidden chamber, the wood wasn't just burning, it was disintegrating. The volatile gases that usually escaped up a chimney as smoke were being trapped, compressed, and ignited in a secondary burn that reached nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. By 10 p.m., the wind outside was registering as a dull, constant thud against the cabin, like a heavy ocean swell hitting a ship's hull. But inside, the dynamic was shifting. The roar of the fire was steady, consuming the small pile of wood with terrifying efficiency. Arthur didn't sit by the fire because there was no fire to see, just a closed iron door and a hot metal barrel that acted as the first quick-release radiator. The real magic was happening downstream, in the 30-foot-long earthen bench that Sarah was now sitting on. "It's starting," she whispered. She shifted her position. The cold stone she had touched earlier was gone. In its place was a gentle, rising warmth that seemed to seep through her heavy wool skirt. It wasn't the scorching, directional heat of a stove that burns your skin while your back freezes. It was a conduction heat, deep and resonant. It felt like sitting on a large animal. "We have 1 hour left to burn," Arthur said, checking his watch. He fed the last of the 30 pounds into the intake. "Then we shut it down." "Shut it down?" Sarah looked at him, alarmed. "Arthur, it's 40 below out there. If you kill the fire at midnight—" "The wager is no new fuel after midnight," he reminded her, his face grim. "And besides, the battery is full. If I keep firing it, we'll be opening windows to cool off." It sounded arrogant, insane even, given the gale-force winds stripping the heat from the outer walls. But the math was the math. The stone had absorbed the energy. Now it was time for the stone to do the work. At 11:55 p.m., the fire died down to coals. Arthur closed the intake vent, sealing the system tight. The roar silenced. The cabin went quiet, save for the wind. The heat source was gone. Now they were just 2 people in a mud box, waiting to see if they would freeze. 3 miles away, Marcus Thorne was losing his battle. His mansion, the envy of the territory, was failing him. He was standing in front of his massive sandstone hearth, throwing entire split logs into the blaze every 20 minutes. The fire was enormous, a roaring beast that illuminated the entire room. But the physics were undeniable. The massive chimney was acting like a vacuum pump. To feed that fire, the house needed air. It pulled that air from under the doors, through the window sashes, and down from the attic. The harder Thorne fired the hearth, the faster the cold air rushed in to replace the hot air shooting up the chimney. He was wearing his heavy bear fur coat inside his own living room. His whiskey glass had a rim of frost on it. He paced the floor, furious and shivering. "Keep it fed," he shouted at his exhausted ranch hand, who was hauling more wood from the frozen porch. "If we let it drop, the pipes burst." The temperature in the corners of Thorne's room was 12 degrees. Near the fire, it was 90. He was roasting his front and freezing his back, caught in a cycle of inefficiency that was burning through his winter stock at a terrifying rate. He thought of Arthur in that little shack on the hill. He imagined the boy freezing, huddling under blankets, regretting his arrogance. Thorne checked the clock. 3 a.m. "He's dead or begging by now," Thorne muttered, rubbing his numb hands together. "Nobody survives a shut-fire night in this." Back at the cabin, Arthur woke with a start. He had dozed off sitting on the floor, leaning against the mud bench. He blinked, disoriented. The silence was absolute. The wind had died down slightly, but the heavy stillness of deep cold pressed against the windows. He panicked for a second, instinct telling him he should be shivering, that he should be reaching for kindling. He sat up and realized he was sweating. He looked over at the bed. Sarah was sleeping soundly, one arm thrown out from under the quilt. She wasn't curled in a tight ball of preservation. She was sprawled out, relaxed. Arthur stood up and walked to the thermometer on the wall. He squinted in the dim light. The mercury stood at 74 degrees. He touched the bench. It was hot, hotter than it had been when the fire went out. The heat that had been stored deep in the core of the masonry had finally migrated to the surface, releasing its energy in a slow, steady wave that defied the frozen hellscape outside. They weren't just surviving, they were incubating. Dawn broke with a deceptive beauty. The sky was a crystalline blue, the sun hitting the snow with a blinding glare, but the temperature had bottomed out at 55 degrees below zero. It was dangerous to breathe deeply. Birds lay dead under the trees, frozen mid-roost. Marcus Thorne waited until the sun was fully up before he ordered the sleigh prepared. He brought Miller with him, mostly to serve as a witness to the tragedy he expected to find. They rode in silence, huddled under mounds of blankets, their breath trailing behind them like steam from a locomotive. As they approached Arthur's land, Thorne scanned the roofline. "No smoke," he pointed out, his voice muffled by his scarf. "Chimney is cold. Has been for hours by the look of the snow capped on it." Miller's face was gray with worry. "He might have retreated to the cellar," Miller said, hoping against hope. "Or they might have—" He didn't finish the sentence. They pulled up to the cabin. The windows were not frosted over on the inside, which was odd. Usually, a cold house had ice on the interior glass. These windows were clear. Thorne stepped down, his boots crunching loudly on the packed snow. He walked to the door, preparing himself for the blast of stagnant, freezing air that comes from a tomb. He didn't knock. He simply pushed the latch and shoved the heavy timber door open. The reaction was physical. A wall of invisible pressure hit them, a solid, palpable wave of warmth that smelled faintly of drying earth and coffee. It wasn't just warm, it was tropical. Thorne stumbled back a step, his glasses instantly fogging over white. Miller gasped, pulling his scarf down. They stood in the doorway, blinking, as the heat rushed out to meet the Arctic morning. Inside, Arthur was sitting at the table in his shirt sleeves, pouring coffee. Sarah was kneading dough on the counter, looking flushed and healthy. There was no fire burning, The iron door of the heater was cold to the touch. "Close the door, Marcus," Arthur said without looking up. "You're letting the heat out." Thorne stepped inside, dazed. He pulled his gloves off, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from shock. He walked to the center of the room. He looked at the fireplace. No, the machine. It was silent. He touched the mud bench. It was radiating heat like a living thing. He looked at the thermometer Arthur had nailed to the central post. 71 degrees. "Where is the fire?" Thorne demanded, his voice cracking. "You have a stove hidden under the floor? You have a coal seam burning?" "I told you," Arthur said, standing up and crossing his arms. "I burned 30 pounds of scrap wood between 8 and 10 last night. The fire's been out for 9 hours. Miller walked over to the wood basket. He saw the empty bottom. Then he looked at Sarah. You were warm?" "I was too hot, Father," Sarah said, smiling as she wiped flour from her hands. "I had to take the quilt off around 3 a.m. Thorne walked around the structure, looking for the trick. He checked the flue. He checked the ash pit. It was a handful of white dust. There was no trick. There was only mass and physics. He had burned half a forest to keep his mansion at 50 degrees. Arthur had burned a basket of trash to keep a shack at 70. The humiliation was absolute, but so was the revelation. Thorne was a businessman before he was a skeptic, and he knew when he had been beaten by a superior product. He slowly unbuttoned his massive bear fur coat, the sweat already starting to prickle on his forehead. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a dreamer or a fool, but as a man who had outthought the brutal reality of the West. "The wager was for the wedding," Thorne said, his voice gruff but respectful. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the table next to the coffee pot. "And I'm paying for the materials to build one of these in my bunkhouse. If you can teach my idiots how to mix mud." "I can do that," Arthur said, pouring a third cup of coffee. The granite basin heater didn't change the world overnight, but it changed the valley. By the following winter, the strange serpentine mud benches began appearing in cabins from the creek to the high ridges. The wood piles got smaller. The smoke that used to hang over the valley like a gray shroud thinned out. People stopped freezing for the sake of tradition and started building for the sake of results. Arthur never patented the design. He just kept the cabin warm. He proved that in the face of a ruthless environment, the smartest tool wasn't the axe that cut the wood, but the mind that knew how to burn it.